Welcome everyone to The Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into this. When we read the Hebrew Bible's strict prohibitions against wizards, soothsayers, and diviners, it's incredibly easy to brush them off as just spooky, ancient warnings about evil spirits or, glorified ghost stories. But what if I told you that is a massive misunderstanding? Today, we're going to investigate a truly fascinating ancient conflict, because it wasn't actually a battle of magic versus no magic. It was a profound, highly structured clash of epistemologies. Basically, it was an all-out war over how human beings can actually know what the divine realm is thinking.
So, right off the bat, there's a massive paradox here that is almost universally overlooked. We know the biblical law made unauthorized magical practice a capital offense, right? But hang on a second. Think about some of the absolute greatest heroes of the text. You've got Joseph in Egypt using a silver divination cup, or Daniel in Babylon operating literally as the chief of the magicians and dream interpreters. They used these culturally recognizable channels and were promoted to the highest offices of their lands. How in the world could the good guys use divination without being condemned?
And this brings us to a specific, totally wild, and highly inconvenient verse from the book of Genesis. Jacob's father-in-law, Laban, explicitly states, "I have learned by divination that Yahweh has blessed me." Now, in Hebrew, the verb he uses there is rooted in the exact same word for a condemned omen interpreter. Yet Laban uses this outlawed technique to accurately hear from the God of Israel. No lightning strike, no immediate judgment, he just gets a true answer. To solve this mystery, we first need to completely rethink who these ancient practitioners actually were.
Section 1, Ancient World's Elite Professionals, the Ivy League of Antiquity. Okay, to really understand this, we have to shed our modern assumptions. Forget the image of a fringe, disreputable occultist operating out of a dark tent in the woods with a crystal ball. The practitioners targeted by the biblical text were the highly respected, elite professional consultants of the ancient world.
Seriously, just look at the credentials of these ancient professionals. In Mesopotamia, you had the Baru. These were specialists who went through years of rigorous apprenticeship just to read the entrails of sacrificial animals. Over in Egypt, lector priests combined complex ritual expertise with what we'd basically call magical knowledge. Babylon had astrologers who literally codified centuries of omen data into massive systematized royal reference libraries. These people were the scientists, the top-tier advisors, and the highest court officials of the most sophisticated civilizations of their day.
Section 2. The Suspect List. Deuteronomy 18's Forbidden 8. So, the absolute crucial point here is that when God draws a hard boundary for the nation of Israel, he isn't just swatting away petty street magicians. He is commanding a radical cultural distinctiveness from the established intellectual elite of the surrounding empires. Notice the sheer specificity of the biblical text here. It doesn't just say, hey, don't do magic. It names incredibly precise professional categories. The Kosem, for instance, was someone who constructed an entire system for reading divine information out of natural phenomena. The Meonan likely read atmospheric conditions, kind of like reading the shapes of clouds. The Mekashep was an herbalist who combined botanical potions with spoken formulas to alter reality. These weren't generic hocus-pocus spells, they were highly specific, systematized, professional techniques.
And take a look at the Hober Chaber, or the spellbinder. This involved a physically concrete action of tying or wrapping magical knots in very precise ritual sequences. The fundamental claim being made here was that human beings, through the correct application of a physical technique, could forcefully bind or loose spiritual forces. It was a literal attempt to compel a divine being to act against its own sovereign will, simply because the human practitioner went through the right motions.
We also have to clear up a widely misunderstood term from this suspect list, the obe. Now, it's often translated merely as a medium, but the text's grammar actually shows that the obe is the non-human spirit entity itself, which inhabits or is channeled by the human practitioner. And this is vital. This prohibition targets the initiation of contact with any non-human being, not just evil demons. It's really all about who is initiating the contact and opening that channel.
Section 3. The clues in the code. Crimes and graded punishments. If we look closely at the legal code surrounding these practices, we find even more clues. Because the biblical prohibition wasn't just a flat, uniform, one-size-fits-all law where every single infraction got treated the exact same way. By examining the legal gradations in the text, we can uncover the precise theological logic behind why some magic was a capital offense and some wasn't.
Just look at the stark difference here.
If an Israelite practitioner actively hosted an ob spirit, meaning they literally surrendered their physical body and their covenant personhood to an unauthorized spiritual authority, the penalty was death by stoning. But if a client merely hired that practitioner, they were cut off from the people, which, don't get me wrong, is a serious punishment, but notably, it didn't carry the death penalty. The severity of the punishment was completely tied to the level of agency. Direct spirit possession was the ultimate surrender of sovereignty, so it earned the absolute harshest penalty. Which naturally leads us to an incredibly important question for this explainer. Is dream interpretation a crime? I mean, in the surrounding ancient cultures, interpreting dreams was a major divinatory practice. Yet if you look at the Mosaic Law, there is zero penalty for interpreting dreams in and of itself. None. It only became a capital offense if the dreamer used that interpretation to lead the people to follow unauthorized foreign gods. The technique of dream reading wasn't the crime was using it to serve an unauthorized source.
Section 4. The inconvenient exceptions, holy ground and forbidden trees. All right, returning to our initial mystery, we have another massive, totally inconvenient clue found in the book of Judges. It's regarding a specific landmark known as the fortune teller's oak at Shechem. It literally bears the name of one of those condemned practitioners from Deuteronomy 18.
But get this, look at the actual history of this exact location. The fortune teller's oak wasn't some abandoned, cursed plot of land. It was the precise location where Yahweh originally appeared to Abram. It's the spot where Jacob buried his household idols to recommit to God. It's where Joshua later erected a massive covenant stone and designated it as a sanctuary of Yahweh. And the biblical text just presents this without any embarrassment. The location itself wasn't an abomination, and the fact that divine communication happened there wasn't a crime.
Section 5. 2 rival knowledge systems, the epistemological clash. So all these puzzle pieces, they point us to one undeniable conclusion. This ancient conflict was not a battle over whether the supernatural was real or whether God could use nature to speak, not at all. It was a war between two entirely incompatible systems of knowledge, an epistemological clash.
Let's break down the step-by-step logic of the opposing side here, the epistemology of pagan divination. First, it assumes divine information is mathematically embedded in nature, kind of like a code written in the stars or baked into a sheep's liver. Second, it assumes that the right human rituals can forcefully compel spiritual forces to act. And third, it assumes that the unseen realm is basically an open database, freely accessible to literally any human who has the learned skill and technique to just log in.
The contrast between these two systems is literally night and day. On one side, you have pagan divination, which relies entirely on human technique to gain independent access to the divine realm. It's humans deciding they want answers right now, and using tools to force the universe to cough them up. On the other side is Yahwistic revelation, which relies entirely on divine initiative and sovereign disclosure. God speaks when He wants, to whom He wants. The real crime of the diviners was trying to build an independent, unauthorized backdoor into the divine realm.
Section 6. Standing in the council, the front door to the divine. Okay, so if divination is the sneaky, unauthorized backdoor, what exactly is the legitimate front door?
Well, the prophet Jeremiah absolutely hits the nail on the head here. He writes of the false prophets, "For who among them has stood in the counsel of the Lord to see and to hear His word?" This is the absolute key. True prophets do not use techniques, potions, or cloud reading to access God. They don't try to force their way in. They are personally invited through the front door of the divine council by Yahweh's sovereign commission. They stand in the room simply because God called them into the room.
And boom, that completely resolves our opening paradox. Joseph and Daniel weren't using an unauthorized backdoor to bypass God. Yahweh used culturally familiar channels of their day to reach them. The exact same thing applies with Laban's divination and those divine encounters at the fortune teller's oak. In every single one of these inconvenient exceptions, the initiator and the source of the information was Yahweh Himself. When God is the source, the channel doesn't condemn the recipient. The abomination is when humans use techniques to bypass God entirely.
Now, this epistemological battle wasn't just some abstract theoretical debate for theologians sitting in an ivory tower. It played out historically and violently across the reigns of Israel's kings. King Saul, completely desperate because God had stopped speaking to him, famously sought an unauthorized backdoor by consulting the medium at Endor. King Manasseh completely caved to the surrounding culture and brought all the elite diviners right into his royal court. And then years later, King Josiah had to systematically rip that entire infrastructure back out of the nation. It was this persistent, ongoing national struggle for identity.
The prophet Isaiah frames the struggle beautifully by contrasting the very sounds of the two systems. He actually mocks the chirping and muttering of the necromancers. Just think about it. The complex, mumbled, totally bizarre rituals of the diviners were essentially a smokescreen. They masked a fundamentally flawed system that couldn't just speak plainly. Contrast that noise with the clear, bold, declarative speech of the true prophets, who simply stood up and said, "Thus says the Lord."
Section 7. The ultimate resolution. Closing the back door. As we wrap up this explainer, we finally see the big picture of what the legal codes of Deuteronomy 18 were truly meant to accomplish. By explicitly outlawing every single form of human technique and independent access, God was fundamentally closing the back doors to the divine. He was entirely shutting down the human pride that said, "I can control the unseen realm on my own terms."
And he closed those back doors to point humanity toward the ultimate front door. The resolution to this ancient conflict wasn't just, a better set of rules or a cleaner procedure. It was a person. The ultimate authorized channel to the divine counsel wasn't a technique we could master. It was the Word made flesh, God literally stepping out of the council room and walking directly among us to speak plainly. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought. The ancient world desperately wanted control. They built these elaborate, elite systems of human technique to forcefully extract truth and power from the universe without actually having to submit to the sovereign God who created it. So ask yourself, if that was their method of bypassing the front door, what back doors are we still trying to build in our own modern search for truth, certainty, and control today? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning.